Today on The Communicative Leader, we have a special guest, Christine Omilion-Sugg. Sounds familiar because she's my sister. She also has a Master's of Clinical Mental Health degree with a specialization in infant, child, and adolescent therapy. She focuses on treating symptoms of anxiety, depression, and trauma, and she's an accredited supervisor to both graduate and postgraduate students. Christine's going to talk to us about the link between leadership and self-care and give us specific, tangible pieces of advice to help us in the workplace, whether we're in a follower role or a titled leader role. Hello and welcome to The Communicative Leader, hosted by me, Dr. Leah Omilion-Hodges. My friends call me Dr. O. I'm a professor of communication and a leadership communication expert. On The Communicative Leader, we're working to make your work life what you want it to be. Christine, thank you for joining us on The Communicative Leader. I'm so excited to do an episode on leadership and self-care. So we know that self-care, it's not optional, it's not a new agey fad, but it is essential to our mental well-being. But before we dive into this, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? So specifically, what brought you into the mental well-being industry?
Hi, Leah. Thanks for having me. That's a great question. So I originally pursued my undergraduate degree in education, and I quickly realized as I was completing my student teaching that my favorite part about the day was when my students would come and eat lunch with me and talk about their problems. So I decided to complete that degree and jump right into my master's in counseling. And since then, I've worked both in private practice and community agencies, and I currently work in a private practice, focusing primarily on treating trauma.
So now that we know a little bit about your background and your passion for self-care and mental health, can you help to define these for us? So let's start with self-care. What does that mean? What's included in that?
Of course. So self-care is something that, in media and in our culture is very present right now and very popular right now. But if we really break it down, it's really just the art and the act of preserving our health. It's typically thought of as an intentional choice or goal that we set for ourselves. And typically what I try to teach my clients is that we can be proactive in our self-care, but we can also be reactive in our self-care. So proactive self-care is the work that we would want to do ideally every day. And this is the working out, eating balanced meals, making sure we're staying hydrated. And reactive self-care would be things that we would need in addition to that. So for example, let's say we have a particularly challenging week at the office and we decide to spend a little extra time with friends or, take the bubble bath or go for the walk or anything that would restore and be restorative for ourselves.
Gosh, I love that. I love so much of what you just shared with us. So I love that as an art and an act. And in a minute, I want to ask you a little bit more about the art of that. But I love that also, like the proactive to me kind of sounds like laying a foundation, like something that is going to be there to set us up to be successful and that we can add on top of that. And what I'm hearing is that, again, not optional. This isn't, something that we, either I take it or leave it, but we recognize to be successful, whole people that we need to engage in self-care.
Correct. It's a foundational piece to our mental well-being.
And then when you think about the art of self-care, what kind of comes to your mind when you think about that?
Yeah, so typically when I'm sitting with a client, in my mind, what I picture is each client is their own puzzle piece. And because each person is so unique in their own puzzle piece, that means we get to be really creative when it comes to these kind of interventions. So for some clients, self-care can be, kind of what I listed. And maybe I fall in that category of, I need to make sure I'm working out and eating well. While I have other clients on my caseload right now that, yes, that's very helpful, but they might need, other outlets that are much more creative or much more active or much more, focused on connecting with others. So I think there's a lot of creativity and a lot of playfulness that gets to be implemented when we're doing self-care.
Oh, that's really cool. I love thinking about it that way. And as a puzzle piece and figuring out what is the right recipe for you today and recognizing that might be a little bit different in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So now we know what self-care is. Can you help define mental health for us and then help us to see how mental health is related to self-care?
Sure. So I think a lot of times these are used interchangeably within media and our culture. Our mental health, if we really break it down, is referring to our psychological well-being. And in my mind, we can kind of break that down further to 4 quadrants. So we have our mind, we have our body, we have our spirit, and then our environment. So, kind of looking at each of those a little bit further, our mind would refer to our thoughts and feelings, right? So really kind of pausing and reflecting, how am I talking to myself? How am I responding to myself? What am I feeling in my body right now? Where can I feel that feeling in my body? Jumping a little bit more to that body-based work, kind of going back to the basics. Like, are we getting the good 8 to 10 hours of sleep? Are we getting that movement in? Are we fueling our body so we have energy? And this is also where self-care comes in, right? Like, how can we treat ourselves both proactively and reactively? In my mind, the spirit work kind of goes into our purpose or our values or our goals, making sure that those are aligned and we're working to align those the best we can, depending on, what season of life we're in. And then our environment plays a tremendous impact on our psychological well-being. So thinking about our work or where we are in school or our relationships or our family dynamics, all of that is going to impact our overall well-being.
Awesome. I love thinking about that in the 4 quadrants. And when you're thinking about each of these and you're explaining them, the mind, body, spirit, environment, I can't help but to make these connections to leading. So I'm excited we're going to dive into that. So as you know, Christine, I'm an organizational communication scholar, and I focus on leadership and work group relationships. And so considering this, what are some of the things that we can look for in our work groups, or maybe it's with our leader or with a peer, where we can say, yes, this is an environment where my well-being is considered?
Such an important question. Yeah, so I think what I would be looking for in that environment would overall be the workplace culture. When I step foot into that office, is it feeling positive? Is it feeling warm and welcoming? The dialogue that I have with my boss or my colleagues, are we dialoguing only about the work that we're doing or how burnt out we are or how tired we are? Or are we also dialoguing about how we can resource or how we can access supports, or that we're kind of having a hard time and we need a little guidance? Another thing that I would be really looking for is, are we open and are we talking about community or even work-based, support? So, for example, a lot of offices now do have therapy or do have coverage for therapy or medication management. So I would be really looking to see what kind of honest conversations are we having, because that really does send the message that we can talk about these things and that you're going to be supported. And, thinking about it from the business perspective, the more supported an employee feels, the more productive the employee is going to be.
Yes, I love everything you said. I wish I could take you on tour to interact with all, managers of America. Does your schedule permit for that?
Yes, please.
Yes, awesome. Great. I love the idea of dialogue, because then we're thinking about a mutual exchange. We're thinking about open listening. We're thinking about the ability to be vulnerable and forthcoming with how we're feeling. We're not just this transactional, okay, when is this due? What is my audience? But we're expanding that. And I also love to think about the content of the dialogue. Like you pointed out, are we only talking about how tired we are? Are we only or mostly talking about how burnt out we are or how hard things have been? Because that's a really good indicator that it's time maybe to hit pause and regroup as a team or to do something that is going to be, as you were mentioning, that reactive self-care as a group.
Mm-hmm.
So we've thought about the positive. We thought about these things that we can look for as an indicator that we're in a work group that, is promoting our well-being. And naturally and kind of unfortunately, we need to consider the alternative. So what is happening in these work groups or these leader-member relationships where you kind of cringe as a mental health professional because you see or hear things that aren't necessarily either promoting well-being or, worse yet, are actively detracting from an employee's wellness?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And unfortunately, I do see that quite often. Typically what I see in those situations is just a very closed conversation, meaning, the conversation is really just focused on work or work production and very little beyond that. I also tend to see in those situations that, if the client and I, for example, are working really hard on advocating for themselves and they work on that skill and then they approach their boss and the boss either directly or indirectly kind of shuts them down. And, that's another thing that I see, which unfortunately, both outwardly and inwardly gives the message of, we don't talk about those things here, and I'm not the person that's going to help you access those resources. So unfortunately, it really does play a negative impact on our overall well-being, but it also does really impact an employee's ability to perform and their ability or their desire to show up the next day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that you're hitting on that sometimes managers will say, well, I didn't tell them I'm not here for this, but it doesn't have to be in those exact words. It can be the way that they skirt around a topic, or they say they'll circle back and they never do, or the way their body language changes when someone comes to them to talk about a sensitive topic, where if all of a sudden they morph from being open and receptive to crossed arms, averting eye contact, and then that tells employees, okay, maybe this isn't the environment I thought, or you're, like you said, you're not the person who's going to help me to source other resources.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very, very important things to think about. And so my next question, you've kind of touched on this because we know that, especially with self-care, it's something that we're seeing in the media. And I've noticed in my research lately that organizations and individual managers are being a lot more thoughtful and proactive about employees' mental wellness. So it might be in the form of mental health days or flexibility for those who need to work from home or would benefit from other accommodations, even access, like you said, to counseling or counseling support. But of course, there are those who think this doesn't fall on an organization or a manager who says, hey, that's not what I was hired for. What would you say in response?
Yeah, I guess I would encourage them to remember that they are working with people and not computers or robots, right? So what we know from research is that production and mental health are closely correlated. So, for example, if I have a client, working in a certain industry and they're experiencing an episode of depression, not feeling supported by their boss, not getting access to resources, unfortunately, that will just compound their symptoms and cause them to regress further. And because of that, we can make that logical leap then that their production or their tardiness, all of that is going to be impacted, or their attendance, I guess we should say, all of that is going to be impacted just because of that mental health piece. So I guess I would just encourage employees to remember that overall, once a person is feeling seen and heard, those are kind of the basics of healing. So even if, as a boss, you don't quite know how to resource yet, or you don't know how to, navigate the mental health field, that's okay, right? We got to start where we're at. So even if it's just listening and empathizing, I think that would go really far with an employee, and then slowly building on those skills from there. And in the long run, knowing that that's going to definitely impact production at work and work morale.
Yeah, thank you. What a thoughtful answer. And you've done such a nice job of integrating all of these pieces. So one thing that struck me when you were talking is how similar our work is in some ways, because there's so much of my writing efforts and my speaking efforts are to managers and just saying employees want to be seen and heard. It doesn't mean we need to agree with them. It doesn't mean we need to do everything they're asking of us, but we need to let them know that we acknowledge them, that we validate them, that they're an important member of our team. And so I see that in your response. Too, I wanted to talk about that connection between production and mental well-being. So I think if someone was really crass and saying, this isn't on my job description, you could flip it and say, well, do you value the collective output of your team? Do you value, the functioning of your team? And if that is the case, which I imagine managers, especially who are so production oriented, would say, of course, then it becomes the right path regardless if you believe this or not, right?
Correct.
So now I want to think about the stigma aspect, because I think this is a nice bridge. So we know in the past there's been stigma around seeking counseling and even discussion of mental health issues. And this seems to be lessening. It still isn't something as accepted as going to the dentist or to see your primary care physician. So what are some things that those in positions of authority, so maybe our managers, our directors, our supervisors, CEOs, but I also think about as being a parent, as being an opinion leader, as being a teacher, what can we do to continue to help to reduce the stigma?
Yeah, I love this question. So I think there is a lot of power in modeling. So for example, as a boss or a parent or in whatever role we are in that moment, if we are having a difficult day or if we are feeling like we're carrying a heavy mental load, I would just encourage, to the degree that it's appropriate, that we maybe share that struggle, right? We share the struggle and maybe we share, what we're doing to manage that or what resourcing that we're doing for ourselves. And what we're doing in that moment is creating that connection, right, with that person. But what we're also doing and what might be more important in that moment is indirectly saying, hey, we can talk about these things. They might be a little uncomfortable or they might be a little bit off topic from what we're accustomed to chatting about, but I'm an approachable person, and these are things that we can discuss together.
Oh, I love that. And I love that you make it so simple, because when things are simple, then we think, oh, I can do that. And again, that power of modeling, certainly my parents out there, we know this from the time we've accidentally said a word we shouldn't, and then it's repeated by the child, or the times we've done something really kind, right? We've shown generosity or we've shown love or connection. That goes a long way too. So we're funneling that into talking about our mental health and into demonstrating to others, like Christina said, we can have these conversations. This is a safe place to do so, which can go a really long way in transforming your work group and in transforming that environment into one where people want to be a part of, into one where they know that they are seen, that they are validated, and then when those self-care needs are taken care of, it frees them up to focus on those production outcomes or those task outcomes, right? So we're starting to see all of these things are interdependent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I have a couple more questions for you, Christine. And this next one, it's focused on leadership and communication and your specialization area. So can you give us two things? So 2 tangible behaviors that managers could do to promote an environment conducive to employee well-being?
Yeah, I love that question. So I think I would just kind of go back to some of the basics. The first thing that I would really encourage managers to do is to check in with employees, but do this intentionally. So rather than going into the conversation to to just listen. I really, really, really would invite and challenge managers to try to really hear what their employees are saying rather than just listening to them, because oftentimes those are very different things and they can be missed, right? And I think the other thing that I would encourage managers to do, and I had touched on this a bit earlier, but is to kind of go back to some of that modeling behavior, right? Modeling, just having a great day or working through problems or just, getting things done, but also those days where we're just not feeling our best, and modeling that that's okay too, and that we can support each other and that we can have those conversations and talk about those things. I think both of those together really just transform the workplace culture and allow employees and give them permission to have these conversations and talk about these things and approach you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so powerful. And I always love the back to basics approach, because a lot of times we think we are far superior to them, but we recognize, oh shoot, I'm not doing these things, or I'm not doing them intentionally. And I love the idea too, that invitation and challenge to managers to really listen to what an employee is saying. As I think about, especially in the United States, our culture is one where we can look at someone, we can know they're not okay. Maybe they look tired, they look a little haggard, right? Maybe buttons aren't buttoned correctly. And they can say, I'm fine, when we know they clearly aren't. But a lot of times we say, oh, okay, good, me too. And then we move on to business at hand. So this suggestion is, a cue to our managers out there to say, okay, maybe this is a place for some follow-up questions to see what really is going on for this employee. And back to that modeling and explicitly demonstrating, this is what we do in this environment. This is what our culture is. So thank you. I love that. So powerful and so simple. So now I want to flip it. So we've talked about what managers can do, but we also know as a leadership communication scholar, we spend far more time being a follower than we do in these managerial leadership roles. So what are two things that our employees out there, all ranks, all industries, that they can do during the workday to either foster their mental well-being, or if things feel like they're, the train is off the track, what can we do to regain that mental well-being?
Yeah, that's such a common question that I hear with my clients. I think I would redirect everyone to the very proactive forms of self-care. So keep in mind that would just be making sure that we're getting that good 8 to 10 hours of sleep, restful sleep, making sure that we are getting our 3 meals in and that they're balanced, making sure that we're getting enough fluids in, making sure that we're getting some movement, right? And I always joke with my clients that, movement doesn't mean I need you to go run 5 miles. Movement can sometimes just mean walking around the block or doing some stretching. Anything like that is going to give us a little boost of endorphins and help us manage our mood. So I think, I think sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming to look at all of those foundational pieces of self-care. So I would just invite anyone listening to this, if you start to feel that way, that's okay, that's normal. But I would also just invite you to maybe just pick one this week to start practicing. The other thing that I would encourage employees to start practicing is called a STOP technique, and it comes from mindfulness. So the STOP technique is an acronym, and it can be used throughout the day at any time. And it's really just a nice intervention to use just to kind of check in with yourself and to re-navigate. So S stands for stop what you're doing in that moment. So just meaning like take a pause. 30 seconds or a minute, that's all this is going to take. We all have that time. Even when you're going to the bathroom, you could do this, right? T is take those deep belly breaths. And really what we're doing when we're taking deep belly breaths is trying to get your serotonin, which is stored in your stomach, to your brain. So it might sound kind of cheesy, but I want you to take those deep belly breaths. O stands for observe. So really kind of going back to those basics of what am I feeling right now? Where do I feel that in my body? How am I talking to myself right now? Am I talking to myself in a loving and a kind way? And then P is proceed mindfully. So what is my intention in this moment? What am I working towards? How can I get myself closer to those goals? What would this action or this response look like if I were working towards those goals? And then jumping back into whatever it is that we were working on before we started the mindfulness activity.
Yeah, how neat. I've never heard that acronym or that technique. And again, something that we can all do and that will pay off in dividends for our well-being. It makes me think this one time I had one of those days. I was laughing when you said, we can do this in the bathroom, and sometimes that's what it is. But I got to a class and it was a large lecture and my TA was waiting and I looked at my watch and I said, oh, this is wonderful. I have a whole minute before class starts. And I still remember he was laughing because he thought it was a joke. But for me, it was like, yes, I have literally 1 minute to sit here and take a breath. And now that I know of this stop techniques, this is something that I will certainly be much more mindful of and be sure to integrate. Because, a lot of times I think that mental health people think it has to be something that's going to take most of my resources and my intention. But if we're doing these small little things, I think that we're going to get a lot more out of it than maybe we think before we begin this process and this focus.
Right. I often remind people that it's the very small changes that are the lasting changes and life-changing changes, right? So that's all this is one small practice that can be life-changing.
Yes. And that's what I love about focusing on communication is it becomes, at first, we have to be really intentional and we're working through it and it almost feels like a performance. But then we realize one day this just becomes who we are, right? We are an active listener. We are an individual who is really thoughtful and intentional with our language, right? We are a leader in all of our actions and behaviors, not someone pretending to be a leader or hoping to be a leader. And I think that same idea applies with, like you're saying, these small practices that become habit and that become part of us rather than, a tool that we're just going to pull out when we need.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Christine, I have one last question for you. So we always leave our listeners with some communication strategies or tips. And since we focused on the link between self-care, well-being, and leadership, what are some of the communication strategies we can practice? So we might practice them with others at work, or we can use them for ourselves. So, you've talked a lot about how we're talking to ourselves. So, we have that ongoing dialogue in our own mind. So it can be communication tips or strategies, again, to use with others or that we could use ourselves.
I love that question. Yeah, so I think for this one, I would kind of go back to some things that I touched on earlier in our conversation. And the first being, just making sure that we're checking in with people, right? Whether it's a colleague or our supervisor, just really having those check-ins. And keep in mind, I think sometimes before I started to practice this work, I thought, oh gosh, I don't have time to do this. That's going to take so much of my day. My day is already pretty full. But in reality, it's just a nice little 2 to 3 minute chat and check-in to see how so-and-so is doing and seeing if, later today they're going to need a little support, or later today they might need me to make them a cup of tea, or later today I'm just going to check in again because it sounds like they're struggling a bit, right? It doesn't have to be a lengthy conversation. It's just a little checking in. How you doing? The other thing that I would encourage listeners to do, and as I had mentioned before, is the importance and the value of language to our brain and our self-talk, right? So language is so powerful for our brain, and that's why our self-talk and being intentional or tuned into our self-talk is so crucial on our mental health. So kind of going back to some of those foundational questions of, how am I talking to myself? Would I talk to my daughter this way? Would I talk to an employee this way? Or am I being pretty critical? Am I being pretty harsh? Is there a way that I could show myself some love or some care in this moment? Is there a way that I could, just practice some self-care in this moment? Even if it's just something brief or something small, just going back to some of those basics, which in the long run really do help boost our mood and our overall well-being.
One of the things, and you know, you were a longtime listener of the Communicative Leader, but we say quite a bit. The way that we talk to ourselves and the way that we talk to others matters. I think this has huge implications for these relationships and how it feels to work in certain groups. So I love that you brought that up. And then the checking in too, that a lot of times we think about checking in with others, right? We might know something's going on in this employee's life or they've had a big project lately. But I like that you point out it's important to check in with ourselves, because I think a lot of times individuals we overlook that because we're so inundated, and it is a lot easier to literally see those outside of us rather than taking a minute to say, oh, where am I? Right? What do I need today?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, perfect. Well, Christine, thank you today for joining us on the Communicative Leader. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I've learned a lot, and I know our listeners will as well.
Oh, thank you, Leah. Thank you for having me.
All right, my friends, that wraps up our conversation today. Until next time, communicate with intention and lead with purpose. I'm looking forward to chatting with you again soon on the Communicative Leader.